Hello and welcome to another episode of Oratio. This Sunday's gospel reading comes to us from Mark chapter 9, verses 30 to 37. It reads, "They went on from there and passed through Galilee. He did not want anyone to know it, for he was teaching his disciples, saying to them, 'The Son of Man is to be betrayed into human hands, and they will kill him. And 3 days after being killed, he will rise again.' But they did not understand what he was saying and were afraid to ask him. Then they came to Capernaum. And then when he was in the house, he asked them, 'What were you arguing about on the way?' But they were silent, for on the way they had argued with one another who was the greatest. He sat down and called the 12 and said to them, 'Whoever wants to be first must be last of all and servant of all.' Then he took a little child and put it among them, and taking it in his arms, he said to them, 'Whoever welcomes one such child in my name welcomes me, and whoever welcomes me welcomes not me, but the one who sent me.'" This is the word of God for the people of God. Thanks be unto God. This story comes to us very shortly after the events on the Mount of Transfiguration, where Jesus reveals himself to a select few of his disciples in his full glory. On his left and on his right are Moses and Elijah, representing the law and the prophets, telling a story of who Jesus is and what Jesus has come to accomplish, as Jesus talks about in his being and in his work being the fulfillment of both the law and the prophets, and trying to communicate to the select few group of disciples what that means and what the implications for the world that they live in that truth might have. Jesus astonishes a crowd with the healing of a boy possessed by the Spirit, and our passage picks up with them saying they went on from there, leaving what is said to be a Gentile land, heading home to Capernaum, heading home to Galilee. And Jesus had some very particular things he wanted to say to his particular select group of 12 on the way. He didn't want anyone to know where they were going, so that he could keep secret the events that he was testifying that had to come. The specific thing to which he spoke about his betrayal, about his death, and his eventual resurrection. Mark tells us that on the way, no one understood what it was that Jesus was talking about. But, Mark tells us, they managed to conjure up an argument or discussion about who would be the greatest among them. And so Jesus, sitting in their home in Capernaum, knowing this in him, knowing that this is the argument they were having, even though what Jesus was testifying about, was prophesying about, was his upcoming death, this tragedy that would bring about liberation, these 12 men are debating which among them would be the greatest. Perhaps wondering, maybe they did get that Jesus had to die, and they weren't really entirely sure when or how or what that might look like. But at some point, right, if they haven't fully captured the fact that Jesus is fully human and fully God, they might be thinking he must die at some point. And so which one of us will succeed him? Which one of us will ascend to power? Which one of us will ascend to greatness? Look at the following that Jesus has. Look at all the people that are seeking him out, the notoriety, the fame, the platform, the amount of Twitter followers Jesus would have had today, the amount of Instagram likes Jesus would have been able to acquire today. They're seeing all of the ways in which his platform, although complicated, although controversial, it has still garnered Jesus a significant following and made him infamous amongst all the others who would stand against the message that Jesus brought. And so they're probably thinking like, well, one of us is going to have to take over when Jesus leaves. And so one of us must ascend to power. And so who? Is it Peter, James, and John because they were the select few that were able to ascend to the Mount of Transfiguration and not tell anyone else what it was that happened? Would it be one of the other 9 disciples who, although they weren't able to cast out the demon, maybe, they made one mistake, they haven't fully gotten it yet, but maybe they'd accomplished plenty of other things. Like Judas carries the purse, like he has the money, so maybe it's him. Maybe it's Thomas, right? Like he seems like a chill guy, like he seems like friendly enough, likable, and so maybe Thomas is going to be the great one that takes over. We don't know exactly how the conversation panned out, but the question remained, among the 12, which one of us is the greatest? Which one of us is the favorite? Which one of us will inherit the power of Jesus, the platform of Jesus, the story of Jesus, and be able from that platform and from that position to lead all of these people who have come to fall in love with the person of Jesus and with the story of the soon-to-come liberation that Jesus brought. The gospel that inspired the people, the story of how this man Jesus would come and heal the sick and raise the dead and set captives free. Who would get to inherit the fame and the notoriety that comes with that story? And so Jesus sits down, brings a little child and sets it among them, and then takes the child into his own arms. Jesus says, whoever wants to be first must be last of all. And whoever wants to be great must be the servant of all. And this child becomes the image by which Jesus, the icon through which Jesus explains what this ought to look like. That whoever welcomes one such child in my name welcomes me. The particular, this particular illustration that Jesus gives us with the child is significant in many ways, but primarily because of the fact that children were the least valuable individuals in society at that time, and arguably even now. Children produce nothing. Children bring us nothing besides, for those of us who might like children, like delight and joy and fun, but they're not accomplishing work for us. They're not adding to the productivity of day-to-day life, right? They, in this particular time, the context, the historical context, here, children die quickly. They don't last long. They require too much work, too much effort, too much food, too much attention that takes away from the day-to-day workings. And so if a child, although destined to grow up and become strong and healthy and all of those things you hope for children, if they were born looking sickly or weak, and they looked as if they didn't have the potential to make it past their toddler years, those children would be left out to die. This was particularly standard practice in Roman society and in Greek communities, but throughout the ancient Near East, this was typical. Children particularly outside of a Jewish context, children held no value, and so were quite easily disposable if the people believed that they were not going to live to a point in which they were actually productive and useful for the family, whether that was on a farm or in whatever industry that the family worked in. And so easily disposal, left out for dead. And even within Jewish society, children did not have any value, any worth, until, again, they've reached a point in their lives where they were actually able to contribute something that seemed significant and worthy. They were able to produce, they were able to labor, they were able to procreate, etc. That is what was important. And particularly, especially baby girls, were the least of the least in terms of the value of children that was already incredibly absent. And so Jesus chooses a child, knowing this, right? Knowing the world that Jesus has incarnated into, knowing the world that he has lived in and grown in, knowing this, Jesus chooses this child and says, this right here, you must become less than in order to be first, in order to be great, in order to be all of those things that you argued about on the way. You must become like a child and then less than a child. You must become a servant of a child. That is the definition of greatness. That is the definition of what a successfully lived life looks like. That is the definition of what it means to follow me where I'm going. Mark's particular use of the word the way is significant in all the many ways that it appears throughout his 16 chapters. But we begin with prepare the way of the Lord, the prophecy from Isaiah. That's on the first page of Mark, chapter 1. Testifying about the call of John the Baptist, Mark quotes the prophet Isaiah saying, prepare the way of the Lord, make his path straight. And now, at this juncture, the juncture that we cross in chapter 8, where Peter confesses Jesus as Lord, Jesus begins to testify about his death and the resurrection that would follow. But Jesus is foretelling that he must die in order to accomplish all things. This is all a part of the way. We are on our way. Jesus has fixed his eyes on Jerusalem, knowing that that is the place where he must go in order to make a sacrifice of his life. And along the way, as they're making their way on this journey that eventually will lead us to Calvary, these dudes are arguing about who is going to be the coolest, who's going to have the most followers, who's going to be the greatest among all of them, missing the very fact that what Jesus has been teaching them all along, and will begin now on this second half of Mark's gospel to teach with so much more I want to say clarity. He will teach with an incredible amount of candor, just incredibly direct, because Jesus is knowing my time is limited and you're not getting it. My time is coming to an end, and you are not seeing the things that I've laid out plainly before you. Whether I speak to you in parables or whether I speak to you plainly, you don't seem to get it. You're incredibly dense. These 12 dudes are incredibly dense and refuse to internalize what Jesus has made incredibly clear to them, but has also made incredibly clear to all of us. In a world that demands that we would self-analyze ourselves to the point of transforming ourselves into a caricature of millennial society. We go on Instagram, we go on Twitter, we try to replicate the things that we see are popular, the aesthetics that seem most pleasing, the aesthetics that will get us the most followers and the most notoriety and the most platform, so that we might fit in or feel cool. We are seduced by the idea that greatness or success or a platform or more followers, that is what will fulfill us, and that is what will somehow bring about peace and joy and goodness in our lives and the lives of those around us. We see, right, for those of us who come to this story having identifying as Christians, identifying as folks who follow Jesus, whatever language you choose for yourself, we come and we read this and we can move on with our daily lives, wondering what exactly is Jesus saying to us? What is Jesus asking of my life? What is Jesus trying to put in front of me? How do I live the life that I'm called to live? And while there are great mysteries in the Bible, while there are great debates in the Bible, this one thing in particular is incredibly clear. That Jesus has situated those on the farthest reaches of the margins and brought them in. Jesus has situated himself with those who have been deemed by society to have the least worth, the least value, the least potential for productivity, the least lovable people, and brought them right to the center of the story. This child is brought quite literally in the middle of them, among them. This child is brought and made to be the most valuable, the center. Now for us, this might seem kind of like, okay, cool, there's a kid in the room. But in this moment in history in particular, this is a significant moment. This child is where he ought not be. And now the rabbi, the teacher, the one that Peter has confessed as Lord, is now holding this child and saying, this is what is valuable. This is what this whole thing is about. This is what this whole, this entire walk along this way, that is what this is about. The way of Jesus is about laying everything down, that all, in order that those who have had nothing, those who have been marginalized and oppressed, might come in. The very movement from Gentile territory into Capernaum is a movement of saying, those Gentiles who you have despised and hated, we are bringing them in. And we're bringing what we learned from them. We're bringing our stories of them. We're bringing our experience of them in to the center of the story. But we are also bringing them, those who you have forgotten, those who you have despised, we are bringing back into the story. The outsiders are brought in. Jesus defines greatness. Jesus defines success in this laying it down, the laying down of our lives for the least of these, in the creating space for the least of these, for holding space and returning value and dignity to those who have been robbed of it. Jesus has looked at those who have been left for dead. Jesus is looking at those who have been forgotten. Jesus is looking at those who are desperate and destitute and lost in their own anguish and in the weight of oppression that has been laid on them for generations. And he's saying to them, arise, be free, walk. You who have been unable to walk, you who have been bound by oppression and paralyzed in the flesh as a result, I say to you, walk. and they walk. To the dead, Jesus says, rise from your sleep, and they rise. To those who have been bound, Jesus breaks those chains and says, be free. That is the work of walking with Jesus. That is what it means to participate with Jesus on the way to the cross and out of the empty tomb, resurrected into glory. That is what it means to live this Christian life. It is not as complicated as we would like to make it. It is not as confusing as we would like to make it. The point of this whole thing, I want to believe at least that the point of this whole thing, this whole life that we live, is to leave it better, perhaps just slightly better than the way that we left it. The way that we entered into this world. That when we leave this place, we can leave with the knowledge that we did what we could with what we had, and we made our world that we share a place that was more joyful, a place that had more hope, a place where people felt their dignity restored to them, a place where Black lives indeed matter, where Black lives indeed are deemed to be beautiful and are able to thrive and are able to be celebrated in the public square, where the systems of oppression that have been weighing down and suffocating and killing Black and brown lives for centuries in this country, that those systems would fall down and those lives would ascend back to the value and dignity and worth and beauty with which they were created. That perhaps when I leave this place, I might leave with the knowledge of knowing that all the other queer folk that I was able to interact with, the lives I was able to touch, that in centering their lives, not for platform or notoriety, but for the sake of the gospel, that their lives were made better, that more freedom was made available to them, that their breath became lighter and freer. They were able to breathe in a way that they never deemed imaginable because of the world that they entered into. We are, and we've talked about this before, I've said this before, but we are in a particularly volatile socio-political environment. We are at a significant juncture in history. With the midterm elections coming up in November, we find ourselves needing to make some significant decisions about what we are going to do about our lives. And I'm not saying that Jesus, before we get ahead of ourselves, that Jesus is asking you to endorse and support and vote for a particular candidate. But what Jesus is asking of us on the way to November is that we would center those on the outside, that we would center those who are most marginalized, those who are most oppressed, those who are most hurting. As a result of our political environment and the leaders of this country and what they are seeking to do with the power that was given over to them by the church. By the church. I often feel exhausted these days. Even when things begin to look better, when things feel better, when the sun shines and fall comes and life begins to take a trajectory in which it seems like hope, the hope that I held on to for so long is manifesting in something that brings joy, that brings love, all of those things, right? Like when life takes that turn towards the better, I still feel incredibly exhausted. And there are a million reasons, right, that I could use as reason for my exhaustion. There are a million things I could say to affirm my exhaustion. And they're all legitimate. At least my therapist says that they are. And yet I find myself checking out of the significant work that is laid before us as a community, as a body of believers, as a family. I find it these days so easy to check out because it has been so hard. It has been so exhausting. It has been so messy. The cost of the work ain't cheap, y'all. It is not cheap. But what is also not cheap is the curse of my comfort. While life has been difficult and all of those things, right? Like I could give you a litany of things that has made life so difficult. But I am also incredibly privileged. I am formally educated. I am in a master's degree program at one of the most elite institutions in the country. I have access to folks who have wealth. And so even though I don't personally carry much wealth, I always have someone I could call or lean on in the event of an emergency. I am a man. I am straight, passing, kind of, sort of. It depends who you ask. There are a lot of things, right, that in my life that I carry in my social location that afford me privilege in ways that others do not have. And so in that, it is easy to get comfortable. It is easy to just say, I am too tired today to lean in. I am too tired today to stand up. I'm too tired to reevaluate how I'm using the resources in my life in order to bring about good and change and justice and love. I'm just too tired. I want to check out. It's been hard, right? So I will binge Netflix. I will binge some TV, and I will check out, and I will do the bare minimum, right? And kind of move on from there, right? Just go about my daily life and forget somewhere in my in articulating my exhaustion, forget the dire situation in which we find ourselves in. November is the 2-year anniversary of the election of our current president, the president who is willing to drag an abuse victim and her story through mud and glass, to discredit her, to rob her of her dignity in order to support his nominee for the Supreme Court, who is the perpetrator of the very abuse this victim survived from, the perpetrator of the very vitriol and evil, regardless of what decade that event took place. This November will mark 2 years since this country, since the church elected this man to be president and to continue to advance policies and appoint leadership and to create a new world in which the marginalized only get pushed further out to the margins, where the oppressed only experience greater oppression, and where the very least of these little children to whom Jesus speaks of, about the children whom Jesus centers, they continue to be forgotten at best. lest we forget that in this country we are still caging children and not returning them to the families they were robbed from. That is what we are doing. This is no different than the Roman context in which Jesus found himself in and testified the gospel in and delivered this call. Jesus did not deliver this lightly. And as we see as the rest of the Gospel of Mark unfolds, Jesus is saying this is a difficult road. The way is not easy. And if we are producing work, if we are engaging in activism that only makes us comfortable or only exists as a way to feed our egos and our platforms and our idea of what it looks like to be seen as doing the work of justice, but to remain comfortable in the work of it, all of that is what will draw us to a place of, I am too tired. Where I believe, now, there are some people who are legitimately tired because they've been doing some incredible work, and all of us are allowed, let me be clear, to be tired. But too often, I believe, and I've seen, as an organizer, as whatever, I have seen folks say that I am too tired only when it comes to doing work that would cost them so much more than what they have already done. There is some work that is easy. Retweeting someone's really valuable words about Black Lives Matter or about queer liberation or about empowerment for women. That costs us nothing. It's a good first step. It is an important place, right? The public square of social media, it is still important to use those spaces for those things, but what does that cost us? Does it actually cost us anything? And I'm guilty, just as much as the next person, of saying that I am too tired to do the work that is so critical and so necessary for this moment in history. I am guilty of looking at some particular things after having paid so many costs to say, I don't want to pay that cost anymore. I don't want to sacrifice these things anymore. I don't want to give all of this up anymore, and so I won't. I will check out instead and say that I am too tired. That I am too tired. Does that make me a coward? Maybe. I don't know. But what I see in the text are 12 dudes debating about who will be great when there are children suffering in their midst. And they know this. This is the world they live in. They're not unfamiliar with suffering. They are not unacquainted with oppression and disappointment and anguish. They are not unaware of the world that they live in. And yet they're debating a question that lacks any kind of actual significance. The point of all of this, the point of walking with Jesus in all of this, is that along the way, we might participate in the setting free of captives, the opening of the eyes of the blind, the speaking of life into those who have lost all hope. The deaf will hear when we participate in what it is that Jesus is actually doing. When we say yes to laying down our comfort, to laying down all the things that we hold on to so tightly and that we are afraid of giving up. Some of us listening have already given up an incredible amount of their lives for the work of justice, and I want to take this moment to honor you and to speak blessing over you. Take a nap, drink some water, eat a vegetable, like do the legitimate self-care necessary to sustain your life. But for those of you who might be like me and want to check out when we are most needed, I want to invite you to consider the cost of this curse of comfort, this curse of privilege, when perhaps, right, wrestle with this on your own, perhaps the invitation from this text, the invitation of Jesus in your life is to consider in your particular social context, how might you be a part of what it is that God is trying to accomplish? How might you be a part of the ways in which God is bringing about liberation and joy and hope and freedom in that place? How might you join Jesus and bringing our egos into submission to the story of God that says that the children must be well, and the work will not be done until they are. Go in peace.